everyone. I'm Mike Ward, and welcome to this Keynote Fireside Chat conducted at the Digital Novel Coronavirus Investment Forum, a virtual event organized by Sachs Associates, which is to provide a forward-looking analysis of the revolution in healthcare that's been caused by the pandemic and how it's going to drive innovation in life sciences, health tech, and the digital sectors. At the time of recording, within 6 months of its initial identification, COVID-19 has killed more than 500,000 people worldwide and infected tens of millions more. It has driven many healthcare systems to a breaking point and has had a massive impact on economies across the globe, forcing governments to provide unprecedented sums to cope with the socioeconomic disruption. In line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by Uli Grabenwarter, Deputy Director of the European Investment Fund, a specialist provider of risk finance to benefit small and medium-sized enterprises across Europe, and as Europe's biggest fund-of-fund investment platforms, is a major backer of European venture capital funds. EIF's key objective is to promote EU public sector policy actions, but with a private sector mindset. Uli joined the EIF back in 2000 and now oversees EIF's activities in impact investing, technology transfer, and venture capital. So Uli, I hope you and those you care about are keeping safe and well, and thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, indeed, everybody's fine on my side. I'm very pleased to join you today for this talk.
Great. So before we address the challenges unleashed by the COVID-19 crisis, I'd like to consider how well prepared we were in the first place. In my intro, I noted that you joined EIF in 2000, and that means that you have already witnessed two major financial shocks: the bursting of the tech bubble in 2000, and then the global banking crisis in 2008. What lessons did we learn from those, or what did we overlook, that might actually inform our response to COVID-19?
I think it's a very pertinent question to start our conversation with, I'm afraid we need to take stock that we are not particularly well prepared in this situation, like in the previous ones that we've been experiencing. It turns out that humanity has always been better in reacting to challenges that were brought to us, be it reacting to systemic shocks, be it reacting to political crisis or alike. But we have never been very good in anticipating threats that we are facing for our society, and that is something that we actually have been experiencing ever since we can look back in history. If you look, for instance, at the threat of the pandemic of the plague 700 years ago, we have not been reacting to that in a very different manner than we are reacting today to the pandemic of COVID-19. What we've been doing at the time is locking up people that have potentially been infected. We have been trying to isolate. We have been trying to determine contamination patterns and things like that. And that's exactly what we have been doing this time around too. The main difference that we actually have been facing this time is that society has evolved significantly since, and our interchangeability and our connectivity in terms of geographies, in terms of groups of societies, and in terms of populations has increased so massively that the spread today is at a speed that is much, much faster than what we've been experiencing in pandemics like the plague. And I think that is the challenge that we need to give us to think that we need to find a different way to equip ourselves in a more resilient way to deal with that type of systemic shocks like the one that we're experiencing today.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because previously, obviously, the two shocks that I referred to were essentially economic ones, whereas this one has gone beyond sort of the impact on businesses, jobs, economies, etc. Given the fact that sort of the threat of a pandemic was not something, it wasn't out of the blue. We knew that there was always that risk. What do you think we should have been doing to prepare for this?
Well, I think there's obviously the fact that we need to be in a better situation to trace the spread of a pandemic. And while we have been dealing with the death toll in countries like Spain, Italy, now in Latin America, in the US, we are dealing with the question of how we are going to keep our healthcare system alive. At the same time, we are debating the question of what is more important. Is it more important to protect private data for people that are hesitant to use tracing app and tracking apps, or is it more important to secure the public good of health and by preventing a massive spread of the pandemic? And actually, if we look at it from a purely technology point of view, there is no need for us to choose between the two, because we have actually the means to perfectly trace risk factors in a society, potential people that are at risk of being affected and spreading the disease, to track them without necessarily violating their private information space. But we haven't actually exploited the technology means that we have available today to do that. And I think so far we have not done it because we considered that we didn't need it. Well, we have just been through a period of 6 months now where we have been delivered proof that we actually desperately need these type of things. And then the other element that we need to look at, obviously, is that we need to go about the research, how we are dealing with pandemics, virus threats and things like that, from the perspective of research and from the perspective of innovation in a totally different way. We need to use artificial intelligence in the development of vaccines. We need to use artificial intelligence in the predictability of the behavior of viruses. All those are applications of innovations of which we have today a massive amount of means that are purely unexploited because we haven't considered the urgency so far. And then there's the third element, obviously, which is how do we prepare ourselves logistically for this? There's one dimension, which is obviously the entire supply system in our global economy. How we are managing the flow of goods and services, and do we rely on centralized supply chain management systems, or do we operate through decentralized supply chain management features? But the other question, obviously, is also, once we have a situation like the one that we have today, how can we come up with defensive tools at scale in time? And I'm talking about the question of how do we produce vaccines once we've identified what vaccine can actually function to protect us against the virus. How do we actually get the vaccine substance for several billion people produced within a reasonable time frame? And that is, again, a logistic question where we have to recognize that we have, as humanity, managed to build nuclear weapon arsenals around the globe that can destroy our planet several hundred times. But when it comes to the question of producing 1 billion of vaccine shots, we are basically still in the Middle Age.
So, I mean, those are really interesting points you're making there. So, I mean, if we look at it, even when we have developed innovative solutions, there's a sort of sense that sometimes policymakers are not in a position to be able to handle it. They haven't sort of set up the mechanisms to for example, regulate. So for example, track and trace and this data privacy. That's clearly a sort of debate. So I'm just sort of wondering, could it be that how how much innovative thinking needs to be there on the part of the policymakers to actually sort of embrace the possibility that innovation can help?
Well, I don't think that the policymakers and the public sector or governments will lead innovation, because innovation happens at a faster pace than any regulation actually can keep up with. And we basically have proof of that even in today's markets. If you look at business models that have become multi-billion companies in the recent years in the digital economy space, take Uber, take Airbnb and the like, those companies actually are valued 50, 80 billion US dollars today, while we are starting to debate the impact of their business models on our traditional business models in the same space. We're discussing social security protection of Uber drivers. We are discussing the fair treatment and fair access to market between hospitality businesses that operate on brick and mortar together with the Airbnb virtual platform of kind of brokering housing facilities. You see from that this debate is happening 5 years, 10 years after those business models actually entered the market. So there is no way that the policymaker or the regulator can actually anticipate innovation in regulatory measures that need to be taken. But I think what is important for us is that we create in the public sector, in the policymaking, in the regulation, that we create the possibility for innovation to happen. Because if we actually restrict that type of innovation, we will by default call on innovation only to respond to threats to the society, and we will not be able to use it in an anticipated way. And that is, I think, the main challenge that we are facing here.
Yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to make actually was sort of covered there in terms of sometimes the policymakers, because they haven't got sort of, they're not, I guess, agile enough to be able to handle these new business models. And therefore, is that not a hindrance if we are looking for new business models to, to innovate, to be able to tackle things like, sort of COVID, with track and trace and other sort of technologies that might come along to be able to actually help with the situation we've got. So I was just, I was thinking, how do we align both the sort of the need for protections, but also the need for innovation?
But I think the alignment needs to come from two sides. On one side, we've got obviously the challenge that governments are elected by people that operate in business models that have been created in the past, and that obviously have a certain scope of business to defend in being competitive, in being resilient against also business models that operate in an innovative way. And there's always a trade-off for any political power that needs to rule in this context. Do I enable innovation on one side, even at the detriment that it forces my voters to adapt to a new reality, and possibly blaming me for that new reality, whilst that new reality would come anyways? I think that is a tension that we have always had in the political debate, and that is something that will not go away, and will make the difference between progressive governments and less progressive governance, because the trade-off of the result of such policy will be shown only in timeframes that are beyond the election mandate of a government. But on the other side, I think there is a challenge out there for the entrepreneurs and companies that are operating in that space. Because if we, as an industry that fosters innovation in a business context, if as such an industry we are sensitive to those tensions in society, if we are sensitive to the net value that we need to contribute to tackle societal challenges, only then will we be in a situation to actually provide ammunition also in the debate that I was referring to before in the political scene, that this debate will end up in a situation that opens up for creating possibilities for innovation to happen. And I think that goes in hand with an increasing societal responsibility that any business has to fulfill today. And if you look at the digital economy, talking about tracking and tracing apps in this context, for instance, we need to come to an era where human-centric computing will actually make it impossible to abuse the power of technology and the invasion in our private lives. Technology can actually make that happen. We need to let it happen.
So one of the things, though, that sort of people who stood back, sort of innovative companies, those sort of high-tech startups, whether it's in life sciences or in the tech space, they're generally looking for sort of very, very large sort of economic returns. Whereas what you're suggesting is there has to be almost like a sort of a societal element. And I just wonder, how easy is it going to be for the investment community to establish a societal value metric that they also measure the success by?
Well, I think this is something which is going to come naturally. The question is whether it will come fast enough. But if you look at the evolution of our business environment over the last decades, I think it is fair to say that in today's environment already, and going forward even increasingly so, the value of a company will be determined by its ability to monetize societal value. And if you look at the dynamics that we see in the market, in the relationship of different groups of stakeholders, between entrepreneurs, between policymakers, between investors, and between consumers and customers and clients in their interaction. 10 years, 20 years ago, showing responsibility for a stakeholder community was possibly a nice to have. Even further back, possibly it was a burdensome cost factor in your business management. Today, it's something where we know that it not only penalizes you in a market very significantly if you're negligent in that dimension, because customers today are sensitive to that, stakeholder communities are sensitive to that, and just look at the reaction of big corporates to the movement of Black Lives Matter that is going on as we speak. So it's not only about that, it is also about this element of transparency that we have today in our environment of business, where actually any wrongdoing against societal benchmarks is penalized in such a rapid way because of the transparency of communication flows through social media and the like, that you just simply cannot afford ignoring that component anymore if you want to create financial return.
So, okay, so it's unfortunately we haven't got much time. I've really enjoyed this. We could have spoken for ages, and there's lots of other things that we could talk about. So, Uli, thanks very much for speaking to us today. And I think the points you're making about how there needs to be a sort of a mindset, and although we see some of those changes already in place, big challenge is, are we moving quickly enough to be prepared for those changes or those threats in the future? So Uli, thanks again very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Mike.